There's a big focus on what the government is going to do with those stage 3 tax cuts. The Treasurer's language has changed in the wake of what's happened in the UK, where tax cuts were shelved for higher income earners. A little under 3 weeks ago, the Reserve Bank Governor, Philip Lowe, appeared before Parliament's Economics Committee. He was quizzed on the RBA's concerns and strategies going forward. He was asked about the relationship between fiscal and monetary policy, in particular, what observations he had about the role he thinks the government has in steering the nation through the current economic climate. Here's a little of what the governor had to say.
So the community wants all these things from our governments. It's understandable. What we haven't worked out as a community is how to pay for it. You can raise more taxes to pay for the things the community want. You can cut back in other areas. Both of these things are very difficult, aren't they? No one wants to pay more taxes and no one wants cutbacks in other areas. Or we can get the economy to grow more strongly so the pie's bigger. Each of those are very difficult, aren't they? Taxes, cutting back and structural reform. We have to do one of those three things, maybe all three of them, if we're going to pay for the goods and services that the community wants from our governments.
Interest rates have risen for 6 consecutive months now at the highest level since 2013. Dr Lowe spoke about the economic conditions that could prolong the period of higher rates, warning against significant fiscal expansion in the upcoming budget.
There's clearly a kind of a setting of fiscal policy that would put more pressure on us to push up interest rates if we had kind of another significant fiscal expansion at a time when the economy is doing well and businesses can't find workers, then that would have put upward pressure on interest rates. But that's not my expectation.
Let's bring in now Daniel Mulino. He's the chair of the House Standing Committee on Economics. Daniel Mulino, thanks for your time. I know you were chair of that meeting with the Governor of the RBA. We'll get to a few of those details in a moment. Let's start with stage 3 tax cuts. Should the government stick to its election commitment and deliver those legislated tax cuts?
Oh, hi, Kieran, and thanks for the chance to come on today to talk about the complex world of economic policy at the minute. Look, I guess when it comes to stage 3 tax cuts, I think it's really important to set the scene and to right from the start, acknowledge the fact that the stage 3 tax cuts aren't going to come into effect for a couple of years. And what our economy is experiencing are a whole range of challenges right now and over the next 12 to 18 months. And they include the inflation challenge, but they also include a whole range of supply side and other related challenges that we need to deal with. And what that's going to require is that in the coming months, in the October budget, but also in next May's budget, that we make sure that fiscal policy is aligned and supports monetary policy, but also that we have a whole range of policies that help our economy deal with a lot of the underlying challenges of inflation. So, look, the stage 3 tax discussion is an important one, but for me, a lot of the discussion that came out of those hearings with the RBA governor just a few weeks ago really focused on how can our community deal with this inflation, rising inflation challenge, falling real wage challenge, rising interest rate challenge that we face right now. And when it comes to people's cost of living, when it comes to people's disposable income, the stage 3 tax cuts are an issue that is really going to come into play when I think economic conditions have changed quite a bit way down the track. We really need to focus, I think, on how is it that we're going to deal with the inflation challenges we have right now.
Yeah, so that sounds like you're very much on the same page as what Andrew Leigh said yesterday, where he said the British government is in quite a different situation to what we're facing. He said quite a contrast there between fiscal and monetary policy. The RBA and the government are very much in lockstep here. So he too, like it sounds like you're saying today, putting some distance between what Australia faces and what the UK is experiencing right now.
Well, look, I think when you look at the 3 major economic centres globally, if you look at the EU and the UK on the one hand, if you look at China, if you look at the US, all 3 of those are experiencing worsening economic conditions at the minute, and all quite different. It's really quite a complicated international macroeconomic condition. The UK and the EU, I think you would characterise as facing an energy crisis, an energy price crisis. China is facing challenges around COVID and some of the containment policies they have. And in the US, they've got very strong demand and ongoing supply chain issues. So this is part of what the Treasurer has been referring to as the worsening international economic situation. So that's something that clearly both the RBA and the Treasurer and our economic team are going to have to deal with when deciding optimal monetary policy and the budget.
But we could be in a situation, as you put it, these tax cuts, the stage 3 ones, don't come in until July 1, 2024. We could be in a scenario where that's an optimal time for delivering that sort of tax relief.
Well, look, I certainly wouldn't want to be forecasting economic conditions 2 years down the track. Look, it's hard to forecast at the moment at the best of times. But look, what I would say is that we face a number of challenges right now. And what I think the government is correct in doing is focusing on, for example, the initiative around increased migration, which I think is going to help with some of the shortages of labour. We've also, for example, focused on childcare as a priority, which is both going to be a cost of living measure, but also helping women in particular to enter the labour force. So those kinds of initiatives are absolutely critical.
But just on this issue, no, I understand that, but on this issue, would it be premature to scrap those legislated and promised tax cuts now, given, as you said, it's almost impossible to forecast a couple of years away?
Well, look, I think for me, look, there's a whole range of considerations going into budget decision making, and I don't want to second guess what's going into the budget. There's also one of the reasons we're putting together an October budget is that a number of the forecasts are probably going to be changed from the forecasts that were in place 6 months ago. And I suspect some of those forecasts may have deteriorated given what we've seen in the international economy. So what our economic team at the minute is doing is balancing a whole range of considerations. So, I don't want to second guess all the different moving parts of the budget. But what I would say is that, clearly coming out of the hearings that we had with the Governor of the Reserve Bank just a couple of weeks ago, and the extract that you pointed to, I think raised a few of these issues. We need to be dealing with some of the supply side issues. We also need to be dealing with issues around growing the economy, and that's exactly where the childcare policy and increased migration come into play, and extra money for training. So I actually feel that government policy has been dealing with some of those structural issues that the Governor identified and that you actually just extracted in the piece preceding this interview.
Is it also, before we ask you about the interest rate situation, just to wrap up on the stage 3 tax cuts, I've seen some analysis by Chris Richardson that suggests that the top 10% of income earners actually pay more as a percentage of the overall tax take under stage 3 than they do at the moment, than if the stage 3 tax cuts were to be scrapped, because they'd go for those cuts are for everyone earning upwards of $45,000 a year. So it's not just high income earners that benefit. Is that analysis correct?
Oh, look, I must confess, I haven't seen that analysis. I mean, there's a whole raft of distributional analyses of the stage 3 tax cuts. And I think, we went through a lot of this discussion in the last term. But look, I must confess, I haven't seen Chris Richardson's particular piece. But
it's not
he's
just for
obviously a very respected
earners.
Economist.
That's the question.
No, you're right. I mean, there are
so.
some aspects of stage 3. Yes, the stage 3 tax cuts do benefit people on incomes going down to $45,000. You're correct there. I'm just not quite sure of that distributional analysis.
Fair enough. And on the interest rate movements, the RBA Governor, in those comments to you as chair of the committee, did flag that move yesterday. If you look back at his remarks, he says at some point we'll not be increasing by 50 basis points, and we're getting closer to that point. So in hindsight, if we looked at his remarks at that stage, he gave us a fair indicator of where the RBA board would land yesterday.
Well, it shows you why it's so important to follow House of Economics hearings, doesn't it? Because you get all sorts of useful tidbits. But yes, you're right. He was foreshadowing that at some point there'd be a tapering, in a sense, and a slowing down. And I think that made sense. It was just a question of when, based on all the data, that would occur. And if you look at the statement that the RBA put out yesterday, they did say that they increased by 25 basis points, in part as a reflection of the fact that the cash rate had already increased substantially over a short period of time. So that was one of the considerations that he alluded to in his evidence to the committee. I mean, the other point that I think had been raised in the committee, both by a number of the members, but also by some of the senior RBA members, is that some of the impacts of interest rate rises have a lagged effect. So there's no doubt that the RBA will be looking at the impact of some of those earlier increases in the cash rate and to see how they flow through the economy.
Do you think there was a risk, just finally, Daniel Mulino, if they did continue on with those 50 basis point moves, that we know that rate hikes are a blunt instrument, but that it would have been too much, that we would have risked recession, as Craig Emerson warned in the last 48 hours?
Well, without wanting to state the obvious, at a time like this, the RBA, like any central bank, is trying to walk a fine line. It's trying to control inflation and to do so fast enough that new inflation expectations, higher inflation expectations aren't baked in. But it's also trying to not increase interest rates too much and risk an economic slowdown or even downturn. So you're exactly right. So there's the risk both ways. And what central banks around the world try to achieve is what some macroeconomists describe as a slow landing, to slow the economy down in that perfect sweet spot where you ease inflation back to the band that you've identified, in our case, 2 to 3%. So that's what the RBA is aiming for. I think in the evidence they gave, they did foreshadow that at some point they'd stop increasing by 50, and obviously earlier this week was the time when they decided to do so.
And I did say just finally, but I'll get you to take your economics hat off and put on your politician's hat for a moment. On that broader issue of the tax cuts that we spoke about before, do you accept that the government running on integrity, that if you broke the promise, that would be a huge political risk for the Albanese government?
Look, the way I see it, and I think others have identified this, is that clearly the Australian public expects governments to keep promises. The Australian public also expects governments to manage government and the economy in the national interest and to recognise changed conditions. So sometimes governments have to balance those two both very important objectives, and that's part of governing in a complex world. And we're facing a situation where international conditions have worsened, where there is economic uncertainty, and these are both considerations that are going to go into, will be factored in as the government crafts the budget and policy moving forward.
Daniel Mulino, Chair of the House Economics Committee, thank you for your time as always.
Thanks, Kieran.